Going live now, Shri, on YouTube, and it's saying now we're live.
Yeah, but I'm not seeing the live feed. Oh yes, we are live.
Okay. I am on mine now. Going live now. And we are ready to get started. So we are live now, everyone.
All right, great.
And I'll go ahead and
Good evening. I hope. Good.
Yes.
All right. Good evening and welcome to the Technical Advisory Committee for Tuesday, June 14th, 2022. Rescheduled meeting. And thanks for being flexible to allow us to meet on Tuesday instead of Wednesday. We have two new members here today, Michelle Kabuchi and Carrie Ann Masters. Welcome to our committee.
Thank you.
Hopefully everybody's introduced themselves to each other. If not, we just introduce the two ones and we'll do it clear. Summary notes, our first order of business for the March 16th meeting. For those of you who were there, we have to, were there any comments or is there a motion to approve the action for those that were there?
Motion to approve. Second.
Any opposed? Hearing none, those are approved. The April 20th meeting, I was not there, so I need to abstain. Mr. Armand was the leader. You would need a motion to accept those minutes. Motion. Is there a second?
Second.
There you go. Seeing none, saying no, I abstain. The new members abstain as well. That passes. The notes of May 9th, May 18th. I was there for that one. Is there a motion to approve those meeting notes or is there discussion thereof?
Motion.
Second. Second by Armand. Any votes against? Hearing none, those are approved. So, hello, Monica. So we quickly go to Mr. Jasper for the review of the 6-year program staff recommendations. Take her away.
Thank you, Chair Boyce. Good evening, everyone. Good members especially. You have in your packet the presentation. I'm going to go through this fairly quickly, but feel free to interrupt along the way if there's something I don't explain well enough. I'm going to cover a number of topics. Let me just dive straight into the context by looking at a summary of our previous funding programs. As you can see in the middle of the table, in bold, the total funding to date is just around $2.5 billion. Mbta's funding programs have generally averaged out to be about approved divided by requested is coming in at about 50-50. This current program is the same. We have sufficient funding to cover 51% of the requests, which is pretty much bang on average. This is the second highest in terms of dollars funding amount that we have available, with FY 18 to 23 being the only one higher at 1.285 billion. But that was for a full 6 years, because that was the inaugural 6-year program. We have 626 million, which is essentially adding on the revenues for fiscal years 26 to 27. Next slide, please. Just taking a quick look at what 2.5 billion has enabled Mbta to invest in. You see the primary modes down the left-hand side of this table. I'll touch on roadway and transit in a little bit more detail in just a moment. But we have 106 projects in total that are funded. Some of these projects have been funded through multiple SPAs, as we call them, standard project agreements. But 106 different projects are being funded. So for roadway, that would typically include new and widened facilities. And typically those facilities include sidewalks and trails, so they're not always included that. The next highest group of projects in terms of funding amount is transit, which includes BRT, bus acquisitions, maintenance, storage facilities, etc. And you can see as we go down the list, rail, intersection, bike ped, transportation technology, and park and ride. So this is 12 years of revenues that have been allocated here from our first funding year, fiscal 2014, and the most recent funding year, which is FY 2025. And we're looking to go 2 years beyond that, this program. Next slide, please, Ian. So just looking a little bit more detail at the roadway projects. Key numbers here really in the bottom couple of rows in bold, you see 33 Mbta funded projects, roadway projects, close on 140 additional lane miles from those projects. And depending on how you do the calculation, if we look at all of Nova lane miles, interstates, principal arterials, collectors, and local roads, essentially Mbta's funded lane miles have added about 1.5% to the total lane mileage in Northern Virginia. Recognizing that Mbta has not funded anything on interstates or on local roads, if we adjust for that, then our lane miles have increased, total lane miles by 3.25%. In the right-hand column, you can see the sorts of facilities associated with each of the functional classifications. And if you look very closely, under new lane miles, the principal arterial, both with and without limited access, and minor arterial, those three numbers of new lane miles add up to about 117. So that's where the bulk of the new lane miles have gone through these funding programs. Next slide, please. And then looking at us on the transit side, specifically at BRT, can't go into this quite the same detail. So we're looking at center line miles here rather than lane miles. In total, Mbta funding has gone towards 5 BRT projects, which cover close to 33 center line miles. In terms of dedicated lane miles, we can only really say this for Arlington's Metroway extension and Fairfax County's Route 1 Richmond Highway BRT, which essentially are all dedicated lane miles. So that's basically double the center line miles, but we don't have those numbers yet for those other projects, since they're still being developed. So for this program, 3 pie charts. The left pie chart has the modal breakout of the candidate projects. So 26 candidate projects. You can see 13 of those are roadway projects. The middle pie chart is showing the requested amount of $1.2 billion. You'll have heard, of those of you who've attended previous meetings will have heard Monica say we don't have $1.2 billion.
I will continue to say that we don't have $1.2 billion.
Thank you. We do have $626 million, and then the total project cost associated with those, which anyway we do like to see, is just over $3 billion. So that really indicates, if these projects get fully funded, the leveraging power of Mbta's revenues using other revenue sources. Of course, some of those projects are not fully funded, so that doesn't quite work as well.
Can I interrupt right quick? Some of the projects that we received, they're applying for federal funds. Some of them are also applying for smart skill funding as well, which we won't know the decision on this round by smart skill until June next year. But some of the projects or locality project sponsors have requested project endorsement of their application on federal side as well.
And just to add on to that, we're talking here about Mbta's regional revenues, the 70% revenues. The 9-member jurisdictions can also use that 30% revenues to as an external funding source on these projects as well, and some of them do that. So going through the key components of the selection process, just a few reminders to begin with. Mbta has no direct role in deciding which projects or modes are submitted for our consideration. Other than for a project to be considered, it must be in the current version of transaction, and there must be a resolution support from the governing body as well for the project to be eligible for consideration. The eligible applicants determine which, if any, projects they want to submit to us, and they each have their own process for deciding what they want to submit to us. The available funding amount is something that's normally determined after we open the application process. So in a way, it's kind of kudos to the eligible applicants that they can contain the requested amount to being about double the available amount, which makes it still competitive, but there's still a good chance as well, because there aren't many programs where there's 50-50 chance to get funding. So that's kind of found a nice balance. Importantly, our process adheres to all the applicable parts of the Code of Virginia, and there were several of those. I'll touch on that in just a moment. Also important to keep in mind is that our recommendations are not based on a single factor, many factors. But I will say that first screening of when we do the evaluation ranks the projects by congestion reduction relative to cost, which is an important legislative mandate that's upon us. So that kind of sets the direction of the evaluations. Next slide. So the four components of our process are eligibility, so that's transaction, governing body resolution, and the project must be in Northern Virginia. The quantitative analyses, this is where the Code of Virginia kicks in, because these are all things which are essentially driven by different parts of the Code of Virginia. Congestion reduction relative to cost, I mentioned the transaction project ratings, which in 2012 were known as the HP 599 ratings, after the legislation which created that requirement. And long-term benefit, which I'll come back to in just a moment, but that's tied in with HP 2313, which is the legislation that created our revenue stream. Qualitative analyses, there are many of these listed here, and then public comment, which is also important. And there are multiple ways to provide public comment. We do have a public hearing, which tends to be a big focus of public comment. In reality, we actually get more comments, many more comments through online comment form or directly via email. But we are required to have a public hearing. For this program, we only got 7 people showed up. Only 2 of them were in this room. The other 5 were actually online. So that's kind of interesting the way things have changed since the earlier programs. So I mentioned long-term benefit, Code of Virginia requirements, and essentially this requires Mbta to ensure that over the long term, not defined, each member jurisdiction receives a benefit, not defined, that is approximately equal, not defined, to the share of the regional revenues attributed to that locality, which we can calculate very precisely. So in essence, it's saying that the money is coming from somewhere, and the way we invest the money has to reflect the sourcing of that money across Northern Virginia.
And that has been bantered about how that is calculated, because a project in Fairfax County that is done very easily benefit Prince William or Loudoun, and vice versa. Those people coming into Fairfax from Loudoun and Prince William, those projects in Prince William benefit Fairfax businesses, residents, whatever. So that is why he said it's not defined really how to do that, because there's so many intangibles. And I'm sharing for the benefit of the new members that you're wondering how the hell you would ever figure that out. Good question.
Well, we're trying.
And it's up to the committees like us to say, Route 28 is a regional road. Any improvement on that road will benefit any county that is on that road. Loudoun County, you get the northern end of 28, but anything done in Prince William, does that benefit Loudoun?
And that's good context actually for this committee, because in 2014, this committee spent about 8-9 months of that year weighing in precisely on long-term benefit. So
I used to look like Ian.
2 years ago.
I said for those three things that I mentioned, they're not defined. I didn't mean that to be critical. In a way, it's complementary to the General Assembly that they left the definition of those
Yes.
terms open for local interpretation and application. And that was a long process, which resulted in long-term benefit principles in December of 2014. But because it was long-term, we've only really, as we approach next year, the 10th anniversary of the legislation that created our revenue stream, kind of now in the realms of long-term, the earliest realms of long-term, which we collectively decided was 10 years back in 2014. So the requirement is only really applied if there is an imbalance of benefit. So first of all, we have to calculate benefit, distribution of benefit, compare it to the revenues, and then if there is an imbalance, then we have to act on it per Virginia code. So in this cycle we have identified the need to act on a potential imbalance, but just to be clear, in particular, addressing imbalances is not about taking away approvals that have previously been made. Anything that's been made stands, and really what we're looking at is current and potentially future recommendations that will address those imbalances, which may mean there's a qualifying, a well-qualified project in a location, in a locality where they've received in excess of their long-term benefit, and it may mean for such project that whereas ordinarily it would have got recommended under long-term benefit, it may not. Equally, when you flip that coin, there may be projects that aren't as competitive, but because of long-term benefit, that is a factor we have to look at, as well as congestion reduction relative to costs and other things. And so that may elevate a project which is lower down the list. And that's kind of what's happened this time around. Do you want to go to the next slide? Just to give you an example of this. So it's a bit hard to see, but there are 9 columns on this chart representing the 9 member jurisdictions, 4 counties and the 5 cities. So this is, if you look at the red squares, that represents the revenue share over the 12-year period I mentioned. 9 of those 12 years are in the past, including this year, which is coming to an end at the end of this month, and then 3 years are in the future. So for the 3 years that are in the future, those revenues are estimates rather than actuals, but we've taken all 12 years together to come up with the numbers adjacent to the red squares, which shows the part of the calculation I said that was easy for us to be very precise on, which is the revenue that can be attributed to each jurisdiction. So you see for Arlington, that's 10.1%, Fairfax County is 41.6%, and so on. And then the blue and the yellow icons, blue triangle and a yellow diamond, are 2 ways of calculating benefit, which is essentially related to travel behaviors within the region, origin, destination, and where people are coming from to in specific localities. We don't really say these are ends of the range, but we kind of use them as 2 data points to get an idea of the range of possible benefits. The real benefit could be higher or lower than those, but part of the long-term benefit principles that we applied said that we have to find an appropriate balance between coming up with tools and methodologies to precisely calculate long-term benefit versus spending that money on projects. So we think we got a good balance, right? And having 2 data points is helpful because we aren't necessarily locked into a single data point. So anyway, the scratchy hand-drawn red lines around Arlington and Prince William are intended to draw your attention to these. Essentially, if we see daylight between the red square and the blue and yellow icons, that is indicative of an imbalance. As you look at the cities, the icons kind of all mush together. It's very hard to kind of see any daylight between any of them. But the bigger imbalances we see are at Arlington and Prince William. Essentially for Arlington, the red square is above the blue and the yellow, and for Prince William, it's below the blue and the yellow. So in Arlington's case, it's saying, the the revenue is 10.1%, total revenue, the benefit is less. For Prince William, the revenue is 14.9%, the benefit is less. So what we try to address this time around is that imbalance. You do see in the case of Fairfax, Loudoun, and Alexandria in particular, there is a little bit of daylight, but for this cycle, we can't fix everything. It's a dynamic thing. It will never be fixed. It will always change. And in part because it depends on how many projects we're in the candidate mix. I can't afford every time we do this. Next slide, there's the summary of everything except public comment. And happy to take questions on that later. Next slide, please. Public comments. Essentially here you see 27 bars. 26 of those are associated with the individual projects under consideration. The final bar to the right-hand side is other. Other is where we put comments that are not project specific. They may be process specific, or they may be completely unrelated. So that's where they go. They are tracked, but they're not something we can allocate to a project. Blue indicates supportive comments, red indicates comments in opposition. So you can see 3 projects here which stand out slightly above the others. On the left-hand side is the Arlington project for the second entrance, the west entrance of Boston Metro. Towards the right-hand side, this is for the City of Falls Church project. And in the middle, which is unlike the other two, is mostly red rather than blue. This is Prince William's Van Buren Road extension, or Van Buren extension project. A lot of the other projects kind of at a fairly similar height and different distributions of support and opposition. But that kind of gives you a summary of public feeling on this group of projects. So we're recommending 20 out of the 26 projects be funded. 17 of those 20 fully funded per the request, and 3 of those 20 projects were partly funded per the request, just for preliminary engineering. 7 of those recommended projects are what we call continuation projects, which is to say they have project funding from Mbta before, or are closely related to a previously funded project, meaning they're right adjacent or a part of a previously funded project. So they're linked but in slightly different ways. We're not recommending obviously 26 projects, 2 of which are continuation projects. So it just goes to show you, being a continuation project is not a guarantee of success. So 2 projects here that have received funding from us before are not receiving any funding for staff recommendations this go around. I also note that we are recommending that $1.4 million is unprogrammed. Next slide.
There's 2 questions. Can you go on?
Yeah.
So out of these, the 20 to 26 projects that you're recommending, how much weight, I don't even know exactly how to put that, but how much weight is that is based on public comments? Like, do you take into great consideration whether there's general public support or not before you make these recommendations? Is that part of that process?
I mean, as I said earlier, there are multiple factors in the decision. Public comment is one of those,
Okay.
but no single factor dominates over the others. So it did weigh in here on a couple of the recommendations, but as part of other things, not exclusively. So a lot of the comments, because they're kind of in a middle range, they're not really differentiating a whole lot. So they have less impact on the decision. So we're looking more at these projects that have, more of the outliers, ones with, a lot of comments. But even then, not exclusively comments.
So we went over the criteria of ranking it. Top dog. Probably the lower ones were the lack of a better term, touchy-feely ones. So it's like better or work-life balance kind of thing. If I remember right. That's what that gets at. I would see the criteria at the top, the eye test chart.
Yeah,
It was baked in.
the criteria are on slide 9.
Yeah.
And then we try and summarize those usually with the color-coded columns in that.
But to get to your question, like I will look at the Van Buren Road project. I think my eyes are not deceiving me. It's number 6 out of 26 for congestion reduction relative to cost, which is a good score. But we received a lot of about that particular project. So I think in looking at the data, the analysis, instead of a full funding recommendation, I think public comments was a part of the partial funding recommendation, meaning that we're recommending funding PE. I think if it received a lot of support, maybe that could have tipped the scales a little bit, but I mean, there were a lot of comments. But again, in keeping in alignment with our charge and looking at the score, it scored well for congestion reduction relative to cost. So that's an example where, we're looking at the quantitative data and the qualitative information, including the public comments we received.
Just in overview, this group of projects that are being recommended, a couple of things that come out. Firstly, with our multimodal and corridor focus, we continue to invest in roadway and BRT projects in the Route 1 corridor, and we continue to invest in the Fairfax Parkway corridor. We're seeing transportation technology grow in importance, and so in the Route 7 corridor through Loudoun County, there's a recommendation from staff to fund that project. It's not a large project, but it is the first MBTA funded technology project outside of Arlington and Alexandria, where that's focused in the past. And this group of projects also includes continued commitment to decarbonisation of transit fleets. The packet of projects is geographically and modally balanced, meaning the 9 applicants, 8 of them have projects which receive a funding recommendation, and all of the modes for which funding was requested have projects that are recommended for funding, so roadway, transit, intersection, bike ped and transportation technology, but in particular, all transit, bike ped and transportation technology projects are recommended for full funding in this program. So continue on that kind of theme of primary modes, we show those in the left column here. You can see the requested and recommended amounts in the next 2 columns, and then the share of one over the other. In the 4th column, you see 100% against transit, bike ped and transportation technology, almost half of the roadway projects by dollar, and almost a quarter of the intersection projects by dollar, to give us 51% of the total request as part of these funding recommendations. You do see the NA column, that's the 1.4 million we're recommended not be programmed. And just to keep a sense of perspective here, that represents 0.2% of the total package. So it's unusual to not recommend funding, all of the funding, but it's a very small amount that it's not recommended.
What happens to that funding?
I'll come back to that. On the next slide, looking at the same information but by jurisdiction, you can see the 9 applicants submitting 26 projects in the 2nd, 3rd, and 4th column, and in the 4th, 5th, and 6th columns. A math on 2nd, 3rd, 4th, 5th, 6th, and 7th columns, the recommended projects by jurisdiction, the recommended amounts, and the share that the recommended amount is of the total funding recommendations. So Fairfax County gets the lion's share of this, which is not surprising given the size of the county, as in the context of the region. Arlington, Loudon, Prince William get broadly similar shares, and the cities and towns slightly smaller shares. Again, not anything out of the ordinary relative to the size. The three largest recommended funding allocations are all continuation projects, or they kind of add to previously funded projects. So Fairfax County Parkway widening gets the largest amount. That's ranked 3 on our congestion reduction cost scale. The Richmond Highway BRT, Fairfax County gets 80 million, and you see 80 million for the Boston MU Metro Rail Station. And just for kind of reference, the Fairfax County Parkway project has 124 million in previous funding allocations. The Boston project has 12 million in previous funding allocations, and Richmond Highway BRT has $250 million in previous funding recommendations. I'd also say that the Route 1 BRT and the Route 1 widening are projects that are linked in that one depends upon the other to happen. You can't do the Fairfax County Route 1 BRT without doing the widening, unless you just want to take away all the lanes. The next group of projects shown here, Soapstone Drive extension.
Yes, before you go there, I'm sorry, go back to can you tell me how we resolve the Metro Rail funding stuff with Mbta? They took money from us and now we're funding them.
So we only fund capital costs. I think it's total amount. The total amount is about $175 million. Now, the General Assembly did divert 102 million of MBTA's revenue to fund the state of good repair, Virginia's share of state of good repair needs for Metro, which was 154 million. So 102 of the 154 million came from MBTA. To date, the balance that we are still trying to restore to the authority, or restore to the authority, is 38.5 million. We received some money. It's previously called the I-81 bill. Now it's the Interstate Operations and Enhancement Fund. We're supposed to receive about 20 million annually. It's not hitting 20 million. And then with the Omnibus Transportation Bill, we did get some of the TOT back. I'm sorry, not TOT, grantors. So the balance is 38.5 million that we are still trying to get back.
That's per year.
Yes, and that includes, of that 102 million, 27.12 million of that came from the 30% revenues of the Metro Compact members. So 6 of the 9 localities that are a part of the Compact.
Maybe I'm not understanding how the Metro Rail Station West Entrance funding is.
So it's interesting because, and this is always,
You know where I'm going here?
I do, it's rough for Virginia, the way the funding of Metro is in Virginia versus the district in Maryland. In Maryland, the state pays for Metro. In the district pays for Metro. In Virginia, the localities pay for a new station, second entrances, and things of that nature. The Commonwealth does not pay, you know. This was long before my tenure on how that was reached. So it is on the localities to fund these capital needs of Metro.
That's not a state of good repair.
That's not a state of good repair.
Okay.
This is
Betterment to an entrance that is falling short.
Yeah.
Long needed.
And what the other thing that I will add, because it does come into play here, when we're talking about the 500 million for state of good repair, one thing the localities can do with their 30% is pay some of the operations and maintenance fund requirements of Metro with their 30%. We can't pay operations and maintenance with our 70%. So the reason why you see the Boston MU Metro Rail Station West entrance is because the localities have to pay for it. And the last thing I'll say, when DRPT last year was heading the study, looking at extending Metro, the Blue Line, to Franconia, Springfield, Quantico, I think the numbers were a reality check, particularly for Prince William County. I think it came to the tune of like $52 billion. And that's just for Prince William County to pay. That did not include the cost to address the poor capacity issue at the Roslyn top.
Okay. Sure, we're not.
Absolutely.
I just think clear on the Walton project, it's an Arlington County application, it's not a metro.
No, I understood that. It was more of a, why are we funding them if they're taking money from us?
Well,
It was also Arlington's only application, correct? I mean, that I have to assume that was strategic on their part, that that's the project they wanted.
I think that's a good assumption.
Yeah.
I'll say it. I think that's a good assumption.
Then the next group of 4 projects here are also continuation projects. I think listed in order of dollar amounts. The Soapstone Drive previous funding on this project from Mbta is 15 million. For the Richmond Highway widening, 248 million previously. For Loudoun County Parkway, this is an interchange at the southern end of a segment that Mbta funded to the tune of 31 million. And then West End Transitway, this allocation is actually more than the previous funding amounts, which come to 4.6 million. Obviously, that's a long way short of where Alexandria needs to be, but that's all they requested this cycle. The next group of 10 projects, these are all projects that are recommended for funding for the first time using Mbta regional revenues. I don't know whether I should go through all of these or not, but
The last one is actually ranked number 1. If I'm looking at it right. Number 2 is the Route 7. What we're saying.
Thank you. Okay. We'll check that. Yeah, thank you. Yeah, so these projects again listed by dollar amount, covering 10 projects receiving funding for the first time. And then on the next slide, actually the next couple of slides, the projects that are not being recommended for funding. Probably worth spending a little bit of extra time on these. So the first one, these are actually listed in order of used to be listed in order of their CRRC ranking. So 96 million requested for Old Centerville Road widening by Prince William County through the Fairfax County line of Route 28. It performed very well on the CRRC rank, but in part that was because it actually functionally overlaps with another Mbta funded project, which was not included in the initial analysis to be consistent with the way we analyze projects.
28.
Parallels to the 28 bypass project. Yeah. So, but even when we actually assessed it with the bypass project, it still performed fairly well, but obviously it went down a bit. So there's clearly overlapping functionality with that other project, which gave us hesitation, and also while there has been coordination between Prince William County and Fairfax County on this project, we do not see that coordination has kind of risen to the level where we can justify a funding recommendation. So that's the background to that one. The next two projects in Prince William County, Devlin Road and the exchange at Prince William Parkway and Minneville Road. Both of these projects are covered by, I think it was 2018, 2017.
Yeah.
Yeah, it was 2019.
Yeah, so anyway, there was a fairly recent county bond referendum which included these projects. So these projects, in our view, already have funding, and they do not therefore need to have that funding supplanted by Mbta funding. So that's why we're not recommending those projects. Next slide. Neabsco Road is the reason for not recommending this one be funded is because of long-term benefit, specifically long-term benefit. The next project, Frontier Drive extension intersection improvements in Fairfax County. This is a continuation project. It has received 27 million past from Mbta. The requested amount, 145 million, is the largest in the candidate pool. As you see, the congestion ranking here is 21 out of 26. So we just felt it's just way too far down the list of projects when there's more highly qualified projects above this, and for its size, and in part because it has already received funding from us, which the county is not really able to advance just because of the way it's structured. Any allocation to this project wouldn't make a lot of sense because there's already 27 million they haven't burned through yet anyway. And finally, the town of Leesburg, which only submitted one project, and this is where the kind of strategic tactical argument falls down, because it didn't work out for Leesburg in the way it did for Arlington, as per our recommendations anyway, is another continuation project, Route 15 on the Leesburg bypass with Edwards Ferry Road. It's not to say either of these projects on the end here are not good projects, but the way we evaluate them, the issue, particularly with the Leesburg project, was they're requesting the 13 million is associated with a right-of-way funding request, which will cover, our understanding is it will cover all of the right-of-way for that project. But the problem is they need 185 million to construct the road. And we've kind of, as we've matured in our process, we really come to realize that it makes no sense to award right-of-way funds to a project that cannot fund the construction. And so when you kind of project that down the road, we have, in this case, it will be $13 million locked up in a right-of-way allocation that cannot be spent, and it essentially is being denied to other projects. So we'll follow up with Leesburg to figure out with them, if we can, what their funding strategy is going to be to get $185 million on this project. Obviously, smart scale, probably federal monies might offer opportunities to them.
So advanced right-of-way acquisition is really something that's never likely to rise up in the evaluation, I think.
I mean, I think it would depend on the circumstances. In this case, it's just what they're asking for versus what they need is such that we didn't want our funding to be tied up, particularly on a project that's ranked 23 out of 26. Okay.
But the project itself is in the long range plan.
Oh yes.
Yeah.
So the project is perfectly eligible for funding. Yeah. It has indeed received 7.4 million from us already, of which about 2 million has been drawn down. I think I'm trying to figure out how to start spending the
It's always hard to spend money on something that will be built 20 years in the future when you have current needs today.
And you're quite right, as highlighted earlier, there's 1.2 billion in funding requests. So we know there's at least another 625 million requests just from this program.
And if I could, we've had a similar situation with the town of Dumfries. And now we fully funded their project, but at one point they asked right of way. And it was a lesson learned for us because we knew the town could not come up with the construction funds. And we were holding right of way money. We're not here to hold the right of way money. And so we did have to take a step back and looking at how we analyze these projects, especially when it's right-of-way request, especially in taking a right-of-way funding request and taking into consideration the jurisdiction's ability to put some funds on the project as well. And lastly, just as a reminder, towns are not assessed long-term benefits. Long-term benefits go to the county. So any project we fund in Leesburg, Loudoun County is assessed those long-term benefits.
And talking of long-term benefit, to just kind of round out this this discussion here, I mentioned Vasco Road was not recommended because of long-term benefit. The primary reason for recommending funding for Boston MU West Metro Rail Station entrance in Loudoun County is because of that imbalance I mentioned earlier with long-term benefit in our county. This project will help to address that imbalance. Now, having said that, there are other factors in favour of this project. Obviously, the overwhelming public support we saw in the earlier graphic. It has a strong transaction project rating, which we haven't really talked about, but that is what was previously known as HB 599. Here, it ranked 8 out of 26 when we look at it on that scale, which doesn't take into account cost. But nonetheless is a Virginia code requirement. So that for that reason it performs well. And then it does fit with modal and geographic balance. Geographic balance, obviously, because it's the only project coming from Arlington, and modal balance because I think you saw earlier that the predominance of the applications to us was roadway projects, and so this actually provides more modal balance in that overall mix. So just very quickly, then I'm going to wrap this up. This is a variation of the table I showed earlier of new lane miles. If this funding program is endorsed by this committee and gets to Mbta and they adopt the program, then the number of Mbta funded lane miles will increase from 140 from 12 years worth of funding to 172 with 14 years of funding. That when we look at excluding interstate and local parts of the functional classification represents 4% of a 4% increase in lane miles in Northern Virginia using those 14 years worth of revenues. And you can see the changes in this table in red, or at least I hope you can see the changes in red. And just in the right-hand column, you can see you've added to the facility type based on these recommendations. So Ryan Road, University Boulevard, and Van Buren Road are examples. That makes me realize that I've skipped over one slide in here, which was the 3 projects that are recommended for partial funding. You see these 3 projects covering a relatively small amount of money, 2% of the total. Each of these projects recommended for funding, but only for the full amount of the PE request. 8 million out of 80 million for Van Buren Road North Extension, and that was primarily due to the it's a high-performing project. It's ranked 6, but there was a lot of public comment in opposition to this project, and we didn't feel comfortable until Prince William has gone through a more engaged process with the community to go beyond PE onto right away and construction. So that's the 8 million for that one, and then 4.2 million for Seven Corners Ring Road out of a request of nearly 95 million. This project is ranked 18th overall. So for this project, also for the Route 123 interchange in Prince William County, which is ranked 15th. Just not quite enough funding capacity on our part to meet the full funding request for these 2 projects, but performance well enough to receive something. So that's why we end up with partial funding recommendations for those.
What is the disposition of land? 2, which is the 2792 Eligibility Way. It's not listed as a partial or a full or a continuation or,
Brown County Fund?
yeah, it's about.
It should be listed because that's recommended for full funding. So we missed it. Let's go back.
So it goes back
So
to,
that-
right there, it says rank number 2. That's what that project is. Rank number 1 is Route 7 corridor ITS implementation.
Okay.
So I don't see, like, the question is either, I don't see the ITS implementation on this list, or
Yeah.
rank number 2 is not properly listed.
Yeah, I apologize. I think the problem is if you go, to that slide, you see the Route 7 improvements project at 20 million, but it's listed as rank 15, which can't be correct because there's another project listed. I think that's a typo. That should be rank number 1.
Okay.
Yeah.
So that's,
Yeah, that's
it's,
Route 1.
it's a new project. But so I apologize for that.
I'll have my issue later.
You didn't see us the line.
Yeah, I don't see the line like I used to. Plus I'm going off the eye chart.
Okay, and then just quickly to slide 26. This is looking at the BRT projects. There are no new BRT projects associated with this set of recommendations. There were none that were added, but no requests made. No addition to the Centerline miles, but 2 projects, West End Transitway and Route 1, Richmond Highway BRT, did receive additional funding recommendations, but it doesn't actually change this table in terms of the Centerline miles or the dedicated lane miles. And finally, our next steps for this committee, our planning coordination advisory committee and planning and programming committee both meet Wednesday and Thursday of next week. We'll hopefully at the end of the 3 committees get some consolidated recommendations that will be posted no later than June 29th, and then the authority will hopefully take action on July 14th at their regular meeting. Ian has got a couple of additional slides that are not in your packet. Discussion. Put the map up first. So there's the map. We can zoom in on this as you wish. This is showing all 26 projects, but we can identify which of the 6 that are not recommended for funding. And then the other slide we have is the summary table, which at the time we put the packet together, we not actually had this available in a public forum.
The table that's in the slide deck that has it organized with the congestion as according to cost, that's what we were using before. It's the same thing. The rank, this is in order of rank. That's in order of.
I think those Loudon projects are reversed. I'm going to just look at that again. But it doesn't change the recommendation. But
Right.
The recommendation.
So what's before us is, if you were keeping track, we've got projects that are being funded either fully or partially. We have projects that are not. And according to the list of 26 here, some that are not. Do we agree with rank? Do we agree with the funding mechanism and the rationale for the funding mechanism? That's what we're being charged with tonight, to discuss, vote upon, take motions to heretofore. So this is where we're open for discussion. I'll let the committee speak up if you have any opinions or thoughts to share. I figured Frank would speak first.
I break the ice. It seems to me that the staff have followed the technical procedures that were outlined and approved by the committee. Now, obviously, there are other factors besides pure technical analysis that comes in. And those are judgments that I don't think the technical advisory committee necessarily have, should weigh in quite as much. But in terms of following the technical procedures that have led to these recommendations, I would fully support the staff's recommendation.
I have a question. Clarification on slide 22, the two projects not being recommended for funding because they were approved for funding via a county bond referendum. Is that just a matter of timing that happens that way? And if they're already approved for funding via some other locality specific way, why are they still ranked and considered if that's just an automatic way?
You want to try that, or you want me to do it?
I'll
Let
let
her-
you
let her
say,
rookie
you know,
do it.
I'll chime in. You can start.
And you can correct me if I'm wrong in my impression. Sometimes counties or jurisdictions will submit things to see if, to put a colloquial to it, to see if it'll stick. And I believe this is one of those examples where it is a good project, it ranks high, it's good, awesome. But they also have a county bond that's not fully funding it, but it's funding it well, and trying to see if Prince William or whatever county submits it, in this case it's Prince William, but any county, lots of counties do this, and see if they can get the additional funding that they need to bring it across the finish line.
Right. And some, no, you're absolutely right. And then sometimes we have a situation because although, in Randy and I both live in Prince William, although the bond referendum was approved, the board hasn't actually issued debt just yet. So I think sometimes, you know, hey, if we can get the funding
Here, we don't need it there, and it makes it easier for us. I don't need to go in front of the board to get that. Boom.
So why, I guess, for, just to help me understand a little bit, that, you know, their CRRC ranking
Mhm.
10 and 14, why is this the reason?
Well,
that
that's
it
one
was-
reason, because if the citizens approve by overwhelming majority, I think it was 70-something%, it wasn't close, that they want these projects and the associated funds, and you know, we will pay for it. That's one thing. So is this really a project that's funding? It's just that it has some funding just waiting on the board action, because the law also talks about supplanting. And what it means is we're not supposed to supplant with Mbta funds projects that are funded.
Oh, okay. That's helpful.
There is the possibility that the Prince William, in this case, Prince William County Board, does not put that through. There's always that. Politics are what they are. And so I'm not saying that they should not have done this.
Yeah.
I'm saying that the reason they did is in case that doesn't happen, or they don't have enough, even with the bond, to bring it across the finish line, see if this will.
Right.
This
And
will break.
it's a myriad of things, because Prince William, we are recommending like $89 million worth of projects. But then, you know, you have Prince William, they're really outperforming all of the other localities when it comes to long-term benefits as well. So these are just some things that we were looking at. I did talk to Chair Wheeler about this, because when the bond referendum passed, that was November of 2019, and then January 2020, you had a new board that came in. So I get it. Our project applications were due, 2020 or 2021, the timeline. Anyway, so we took several factors into consideration, because what we don't want the General Assembly to come back and say, hey, you know, if these projects have other funding sources, then why are you funding them? We don't want to receive that sort of attention and questioning, especially since the law does mention supplanting.
And this isn't unprecedented, because a couple of cycles ago, Loudoun County submitted a funding request which was recommended. But at some point before the adoption, during the evaluation process, we heard that they've been awarded a 25 million hydro grant. And we said, well, you can only spend that on this project, so we're not going to give you 25 million of what we previously recommended that we would give you, because you've already got the 25 million from somewhere else. We've put that 25 million elsewhere in the region. So it's not without precedent.
There was the whole Route 2866 interchange thing that went on. Yeah, this happened.
Thank you.
I mean, the good thing is that the revenues will get deployed elsewhere in the region. It's not like they're lost.
Yeah.
But it's just, yeah, there was another funding source there with
The
the
guardrails work.
Yeah.
Another question, when you receive the public comment and consider it, you know, and there's a lot of opposition, you take into account just that it was either opposed or supported, or is it the nature of the opposition? Does that actually come into it as well?
Generally speaking, it's the volume. But I think what we would say is that for projects that do ultimately get approved, we only make recommendations and the authority will approve. You know, that it's a matter of public record what those comments were. We would certainly encourage the applicants to look at the comments from the project development perspective, so they understand before they move those projects forward what the concerns are, and address those concerns, which you know we would expect them to do through a preliminary engineering approach, by part of which will be hopefully to engage with the public on environmental and other factors.
Right.
So it gives them the ability to do that without committing Mbta to a large amount of funding at this time. They can always come back later and request more money, right away and construction money later.
Right, because sometimes comments are really in opposition for personal reason or whatever reason, and then you sometimes have entities that say, hey, we don't like certain types of projects. You know what I'm saying? And we do try to be aware, make sure we're aware of that, but we still report the comments we receive. But I'll go back to last Thursday night when we had the authority meeting, and Chairman McCase, and he said this and it's on YouTube, Richmond Highway BRT received a lot of support. Richmond Highway widening did not. And he's like, the BRT, as Keith noted previously, doesn't work without the widening, but you get to, the nature of some of the comments. Although they're separate projects, they are working as one project for the purposes of widening the Richmond Highway so you can put a fixed guideway BRT in the center line. So while we do report on the comments we receive, we're not here to make judgments as staff on the comments. We know that sometimes it's just the nature of it. And on the flip side, we can get a lot of support for a particular project. I'll go back a few years ago, which we had our public hearing in person with the town of Hillsborough. Population of 123, and I may be inflating it a bit. They brought out half the town and then some in support of their Route 9 project. So we try to take it all into consideration. And that's
124.
So that's why, while we are looking at public comment, that is a factor, but it's really we have multiple consideration points.
Yes, sir.
So going back to the discussion we had before about right-of-way, and tying up funding in right-of-way projects. Just curious, given along with that logic, just looking at the partially funded projects, these projects, what I can see, the amounts requested are pretty much the entire project cost. And so in these cases, you're giving them effectively 10%, 5%, less than 5% of the money. What are they going to do with that?
So it's interesting because, again, I think all of these are PE. Correct me if I'm wrong, Pete.
They're getting 100% of the PE phase.
Getting 100%
That's
of
what we'll cover.
Yes.
100% of the PE request.
Yes,
Okay.
not the phase. We try not to ever partially fund a phase. We don't want that situation as well. And also, some of our larger localities, they can put in other funding sources to ensure the projects advance versus some of our smaller localities are in positions that they're unable to do so. Now, what I will say about the Leesburg project, that's another project that they're applying for federal funds. They have a smart scale application that's in. So when we do the call for projects, is it next year? Is it next year?
Yep.
whew, next year, their project may be in a better position financially to have additional funding sources on it. And what we always try to make sure we're doing, especially if the town is applying, because for us, we have 5 towns that can apply directly to the authority. And those are the towns with a population of 3,500 or more. When I mentioned the town of Hillsborough, because they have 123 or 24, the county applied because the law identifies that it makes reference to those towns, the 5 largest towns in Virginia. But what we try to do, or Northern Virginia, make sure that the county and the towns are in communication, because we have seen instances where the county will say, okay, we can help you out. Now, I'm not trying to put a county on the hook, but we try to encourage that coordination. And I will even say, going back to Route 1 in Dumfries, now the county is implementing that project on behalf of the town. So they're working in tandem, but we try to make sure we foster and make sure that communication is happening. Number one, because you long-term benefits. Number two, it keeps the regional aspect and the regional communication open. And that's just not for towns and counties. When Keith talked about the old Centerville Road project, which impacts Prince William County, they were the applicant, but it also impacts Fairfax County as well. So we want to make sure that that coordination is happening and really happening long before the application gets to us.
Else? Brianne? I echo what Frank said. Things look to be in order, and the process has been followed. So anybody have a motion to approve?
Motion.
A second? Yes, sir.
Will we take questions, or do we not take questions?
After the vote.
After the vote?
We need a second.
Second.
All those in favor, say aye. Aye. Anybody opposed? Okay. Motion is approved. Did you have a question, sir?
Yes, I'm Rob Whitfield, and I've attended Mbta meetings since 2014. And I was away for the public meeting last month. I was in Colorado. So, but I did send to Monica some comments about the Boston Metro station, including the fact that the ridership at that station has declined from, I can't remember the precise number, in the 10 to 12,000 riders per day. And I think it's now down to about 4,500. And Monica indicated to me that the funding that we're discussing is for 2 future years, I think.
Fiscal years 26 and 27.
Right. And so what I said to her is, well, it seems to me as a precondition of Mbta approving funding, that there should be some demonstration of ridership. I used to be a commercial real estate appraiser for years, and I knew Boston very well. It's about 70, but it's a successful mixed-use community. It's about 70% built out. And frankly, I don't see the second. I mean, yes, there are a few people at the western end of Boston who are going to benefit, but I don't see a justification. The total project cost is now about 160 million. And I don't know where the other 80 million is coming from. I don't know if that's described in the materials that you put together. But I want to see, in fact, that applies not just to Boston, but to all of these projects, the major ones, like, let's say, Fairfax County Parkway. We need to be able to understand, obviously, that's going to have to be done in segments over a long period of time. But, and in fact, a far bigger problem is that Virginia as a whole hasn't required financial plans for transit projects. Steve Cotard, who's was the head of DRPT Finance, is now head of Virginia Passenger Rail Authority. I've known Steve for 10 years. And it wasn't until about 4 years ago I discovered that. And And frankly, the General Assembly should get off its bottom and do something, because we obviously had huge problems with the Dulles Rail project. And I suspect we'll have additional future problems with other transit projects. So I'm all for equality and fairness. Yeah, just to show you, it's not just a transit project. I live in the Reston area, and I told Monica the other day that the Soapstone connector, when I started going to meetings in 2013, 2014, the estimated cost of that project was $93 million. It's now up at $235 million. I've asked Tom Bashadney more than once, please explain what's caused the huge increase in costs. And you know, I'm looking for cost effectiveness, and so Soapstone at $235 million is not going to be very cost effective. In fact, more problematic is the fact in Reston, the far bigger near-term demand in the next 10 years is going to be for the Reston Town Center underpass, which, you know, and when I told Tom that 5 years ago, I mean, look, some of you know me well enough. I don't give up easily. And all I can say is I've been ignored at every step of the way by both Fairfax County and by the Commonwealth DRPT. And I'm going to try, I don't know what I'm going to do to break this logjam, but Monica knows I try hard to be fair, and I just want fair play. And I don't, especially the Hillsborough thing, I was there, whenever that was 3 or 4 years ago. I literally walked out of the meeting because it was just ridiculous. So the question is, how much, you know, what do you guys want to do in the technical committee? You want to be a rubber stamp for a body of politicians? Or some of you, I know Randy's a civil engineer. I don't know the background of any other of you. I was a civil engineer 45 years ago. I'm not so civil these days. So I'm perfectly happy to help, and I want to give my input, and I will give it to Monica. And so I'm sort of disappointed. And so I don't know if I've said this so that you understand. I'm not coming at this from ignorance. And it's not that I have a personal bias this way or the other. I just want cost-effective projects.
Thank you.
Oh, one final question. Are we FY 22 to 27? Is this fiscal year, are you actually preparing to fund projects this?
So we've covered all the previous funding years, 22 through 25, and previous funding programs. So we're only, the new years are fiscal years 26 and 27. Those are the new fiscal years that we're adding.
So my recommendation for Boston is that you have a requirement to revisit in a couple of years and require Arlington County to demonstrate that the ridership demand is indeed increasing, because it would be foolish.
As their project, that's up for them to do. It's their project to run.
But they're asking the region to pay for it.
Yes.
And Rob, what I would say, number one, I appreciate the technical advisory committee coming out, giving their time, because the law charges them to really look at the technical and make technical recommendations and look at the technical. The TAC is not to get into some of the politics. Now, you know, we do have committees that get into some of the politics of it. And of course, all of the meetings are open meetings. So I get your frustration. Please come to those committee meetings as well. But I don't want the TAC to feel as if they're not doing their job, because they are. It's hard to, and we have a model, and the model, one of the things we give priority to, or the thing we give priority to, are the projects that have the greatest level of congestion reduction relative to cost. While we give priority to that, the law also says you have to look at these other performance measures, which we classify as the transaction rankings. And then we look at past performance. We look at public comments. You know, it's a myriad of things we look at to get to a staff recommendation. One thing that Keith was noting about next steps is the final recommendation that comes to the authority or goes to the authority is from the Planning and Programming Committee. So what we as staff will do, we will take what we've heard tonight from the Technical Advisory Committee. The Planning Coordination Advisory Committee meets next week. We will take their recommendation and then we will share that with the Planning and Programming Committee. That's important because the Planning and Programming Committee is comprised of 5 authority members. And they make the final recommendation to the authority. But I just want this committee to know, and I get your frustrations, Rob, that we appreciate the work, because this is several months, years of work, because while I'm saying months, we're still doing the transaction update. And because this is out year money, we assume that ridership on Metro will come back. Now, will it be back to pre-COVID? I can't answer that. Will it come back? We assume that it will continue to pick up. But for the cost, congestion reduction relative to cost, one of the things we look at, you see how the project's forward.
When is the next board meeting?
The next authority meeting is July 14th. That's the meeting where the authority is expected to take action on the 6-year program recommendation.
That's where these comments.
Yeah, or even if you, and well, we're still recording. I'll talk to you offline.
Yeah.
But again, we have 2 more committees that are meeting next week.
So
This is
sorry. This is our time and we're running along. So if you don't mind, I'd like to get
I'll
into
put it in writing.
Yes, please. Status of the transaction plan update, Mr. Gasper.
It's ongoing, very much in the background as far as the outside world is concerned, because we're not quite ready and we don't want to distract from the considerations on the 6-year program, but we are planning to, on the same evening that the 6-year program is scheduled to be adopted, to also go to the authority that evening and request their approval for for a public hearing for transaction, public comment period, which currently we're looking at September authority meeting for public hearing and a public comment starting over the summer and continuing into September with a view to getting transaction adopted by the end of this year. You had a briefing last month's meeting, I think, on transaction. You've heard a lot of the analysis already. There's some stuff that they're wrapping up. We're working on the document. You may recall last time it was a fairly simple kind of summary document, but we're using the same template this year. Probably a little bit more information in it, but that combined with an updated project list is being finalized and kind of put into a draft format. So I'm not sure in what state it will be in exactly the next time you meet in July, but probably it will be in some fairly advanced draft by then, because we're looking to go public comment at the end of July. So we'll give you an update then, and then you'll have several months in the fall to weigh in on the plan for, and you know, as this evening make some recommendations on whether or not the authority should.
You're up next.
I will be brief. So you may, or as you may or may not be aware, the General Assembly goes back Friday at noon to discuss budget, and we will see the clock is ticking. We're under normal circumstances would have a new budget starting July 1, but the General Assembly is reconvening this Friday. There is talk about the gas tax suspension again, so I just don't know how that's going to shake up, but I will keep you posted. The other thing I see you on the agenda, it says next meeting July 15th. Keith, is that that's Friday? And we may want to check that, because I hope that
I'm
you
not
all
meeting on
didn't
Friday.
approve.
I'll be right back.
So we'll correct that. And that's all I have, Mr. Chair.
Could be the second Wednesday?
20th.
Third,
20th.
Should be the 20th.
yeah. And that's all I have.
Is there an issue with July 20th date?
Essentially for me, yes, for public.
You told me about that. Most of us know. Right, motion to adjourn.
So moved.
Somebody seconded. We all approve.